All right, hey guys, today we're going to talk about abolition, which was the movement to end slavery, and we're going to talk about the different characters that were involved in that process and the different belief systems, I guess, also. So we're going to start with what is abolition, name two abolitionists and what they did to end slavery, identify American colonization society, and what were the results of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. Okay, so we're going to start with, obviously, the definition I already said. Movement to end slavery is abolition. And you need to kind of know the historical context, what's been going on in the past. And it says from the earliest days of our country, lots of Americans were against slavery, and many early reformers believed in what was called gradualism. So this is the belief that we would gradually end slavery, that it would not be a, quick overnight thing, done, no more slaves. It would be more slowly, but would eventually get rid of slavery. So here is this process of gradualists proposed, and you got to know it in order. So new slaves would be stopped from coming into the United States from Africa or any other location. So no more slaves brought in by boat into the Americas. Next, phase out slavery in the North, which, we've already seen a great reduction in slave labor there anyway. So they're going to get rid of it in the North and the Upper South. So this would be such as Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina. We're at the bottom of the Upper South. So anything North Carolina and up, this is where they would get rid of it. And then ending slavery in the Lower South. Okay, the Lower South, which would be all the rest. I was going to show you that, but it didn't have America on the back. So I'm going to use that in a minute. So you need to know that the last phase would be the Lower South, Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina. And so supporters of this system thought, okay, it'll give the economy of these states in the South time to adjust to the lack of slave labor, time to sort of get over it, if you will. So with that also comes an introduction to the American Colonization Society, which will be founded in 1816 with the idea of moving African Americans back to Africa. And they actually acquired land in Africa. And it says the following year, African Americans began boarding ships chartered by the society to take them to Africa. And they will establish a colony that becomes Liberia, declared its independence in 1847, adopts a constitution, and the capital of Liberia, where we're sending African Americans back to Africa, is called Monrovia, named after President Monroe. So I'm going to show you here in a bigger format, okay? So this is the whole world, and we're talking about sending the slaves from here, African Americans from here, back to Africa, and most specifically down here to Liberia. And let me find it specifically right there, the brown one. So to Liberia, so this is Liberia. So from America to Liberia is where we're going to send them. And the capital of Liberia is going to be Monrovia. I have a closer up map of that to show you. So there it is, the coast of Africa. Liberia is the nation. Monrovia is the capital, named after President Monroe. Still named that to this day. Okay, so some African Americans are going to go back to Africa, although it's not going to be nearly as many as you might think that choose that path. Okay, so now we're going to talk about early abolitionists. First is David Walker, a free black man from North Carolina. Make sure you know he's from North Carolina. Walker's going to publish a book, Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World. He does advocate violence and rebellion as a way to end slavery. So that, he's basically advocating that slaves rise up and kill their masters and fight for their freedom physically. William Lloyd Garrison is a white dude So he founds the anti-slavery newspaper called The Liberator, and he calls for not gradualism, but immediate end to slavery, absolute emancipation. This word, your first introduction to it, means the freeing of all enslaved people. So like, boom, they're all freed. And no more slavery exists, okay? So it says Garrison founded the American Anti-Slavery Society. It had over 250,000 members. So a movement to end slavery, American Anti-Slavery Society, with emancipation, freeing all these slaves. And this movement to free them. Now, he's going to advocate for that. He's going to talk about that in his newspaper, The Liberator. White guy. Okay, let me show you pictures. Here's David Walker. I don't have a picture of Lloyd Garrison, but he's white, just trust me. Here's David Walker from North Carolina, who advocated violence to end slavery. And just remember, William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper is called The Liberator. He wants immediate end to slavery. Okay, then we have Frederick Douglass with 2 S's on the end. He actually escaped from slavery in Maryland, writes his own autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and publishes his own anti-slavery newspaper called the North Star. The significance of the North Star was that it led slaves to freedom. They followed that star at night along the Underground Railroad. They traveled at night, and they would walk to the north, to freedom, following the North Star. So he's a big deal because he goes on a public speaking circuit talking to folks up north about how evil slavery is from his days as a slave. So he is a former slave, teaches himself how to read while enslaved, which is a really cool story, and begins to publish his own newspaper. Then you have Sojourner Truth, who was also a slave, but the difference here is, obviously, she's a woman, and she gained her freedom in 1827. She also goes on the circuit giving anti-slavery speeches, and you'll get to hear from her a little bit later, an actress that reenacts one of her famous speeches. So she's a really, really exceptional individual. Her background is really amazing. She had somewhere between 11 to 13 kids. I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but most of them were sold away from her to other plantations. And she will walk to her own freedom carrying one of her children. Amazing woman. And then, of course, you have the Grimke sisters. The Grimke sisters, 2 sisters from South Carolina who were raised by slaves. So they are white. They are South Carolinians living on a plantation, and they're raised by the slave ladies there. They're nannies, and as they grow up, they kind of see the horrors of slavery, disagree with what their parents are doing, and they move to the north and join the anti-slavery campaign. All right, so let me show you a couple of these. I think I stopped at Frederick Douglass. So here he is, Frederick Douglass, who edits the newspaper The North Star, gives a lot of speeches about his days as a slave, taught himself how to read. Also Sojourner Truth, here she is. You will hear from her later, Sojourner Truth. And the Grimke sisters, they're just not attractive. But anyway, here they are, bless their hearts, from South Carolina, who will move from the South to the North and advocate against slavery, which is sort of amazing. Okay, so then you have reaction to the movement. So the first of that is called the gag rule. And this is interesting, and we will build on it as the semester continues. But slavery was prevented from being discussed on the congressional floor because they were so afraid that there would be heated debate. Because you got the South more entrenched in slavery, the North is now freeing their slaves and getting away from slavery, and you have kind of the two clashing in Congress, and Southern representatives against Northern representatives, and so the gag rule is really gagged and could not talk about it, right? So nobody's talking about slavery, which won't last very long. Then you have Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831. He is a enslaved preacher So he's a slave. He leads an uprising that kills over 50 Virginians. So he is probably one of the most successful, leads one of the most successful slave rebellions. Many Southerners believe that the newspapers like the Liberator and the North Star sparked this revolt. So therefore, the masters became more afraid of another slave uprising, and they began to assert greater punishments on their slaves, even killing slaves who escape when they're caught, and other horrible punishments on the plantation to prevent uprisings such as this. This became a huge fear of white plantation owners, that there would be another Nat Turner's rebellion. I've had students in the past ask me, why would they think, the plantation owners, that the slaves were encouraged by newspapers when slaves couldn't read? Well, actually, several preachers, if you had an enslaved preacher on the property, or a slave who was deemed the pastor, he often had taught himself how to read, or had been tutored secretly how to read from another slave who knew. And he would get access to these papers. Now, they may be months late, when they would get their hands on them, but they would share that information with the slaves on the plantation. Okay, so we need to discuss here. Well, let me show you Nat Turner. Sorry, let me show you his a picture. Nat Turner's Rebellion, which is really cool, showing you the slaves, which interestingly are dressed really nicely in this cartoon, which was another, this is a Southern interpretation. See, this is a horrid massacre in Virginia, but I can assure you the slaves are not dressed as nice on the plantations, killing their masters. Okay, so in the antebellum pre-Civil War period, this is prior to the Civil War, we call it antebellum, there are two kinds of slavery. You have rural slavery, plantations, field workers, house slaves. This was a very difficult lifestyle, which I'll come back to. You were outside a lot if you were a field worker. If you were in the house, you were at least inside from the elements of cold or rain. But the bad news is, in many cases, you were closer to the master's family, and that could be actually bad for you. Or urban slavery, which do have slaves in the cities, which would, in a way, this was good. They were taught a skill, so that was helpful to them later in life. But the prejudice could be just as bad. I mean, I've read all sorts of beatings by masters who lived in the city, who maybe owned a business, but would still beat their slaves just unmercifully. So really, the beatings there weren't much difference there. Anti-slavery arguments, folks against slavery in the North. So this is morally wrong. Why are folks in the South enslaving people? It's just immoral. And the Constitution provides freedoms to all citizens, and they felt like that slaves should be considered citizens and protected. Pro-slavery arguments, I brought my Bible with me, they're going to say the Bible defends slavery. They're going to quote Exodus, talking about slaves should obey their masters. And they're also going to claim they provide a Christian upbringing to their slaves, which is really a lot of nonsense. But anyway, they're going to say that. They're also going to say slaves are happy on the plantation, which is another ridiculous myth, because most slaves were miserable on plantations and just wanted their freedom. I'm going to quickly go back to this. I read a book called Celia, who was a house slave, and she was raped by the master multiple times. She had children by him, so they were of mixed race. And the mistress of the plantation went after her and tried to kill her. She was a house slave. So, being a house slave wasn't always ideal. All right, the essential question is abolition, is a movement to end slavery. To abolitionists, I'm going to leave that to you to pick some of the folks on the other sheet. American Colonization Society was a movement to move African Americans back to Africa. They're going to form the country of Liberia. And the results of Nat Turner's Rebellion, slave owners are more harsh and become afraid of the next uprising. Okay, you need to make sure you also do your summary.